The mortar hit the eastern colonnade at dawn, and Queen Ithara Velsundren's first thought was not of the war, or of the refugees huddled in the basement vaults beneath the old governor's palace, or even of the crack that split the ceiling above her war table. Her first thought, sharp and unwelcome, was of a human standing in a doorway 12 years ago, holding a canteen he'd filled from the last clean spring on Verath Station, saying, "You looked thirsty." She killed the memory before it could breathe. She had a city to hold. "Casualties," she said, already moving toward the blown-out window. Commander Thesic, her senior military advisor, brushed powdered stone from his shoulder plates. His gray-blue skin was paler than usual, the cold tint that signaled stress in Velsundren physiology, something no outsider would notice but that Ithara read like handwriting. 3 wounded in the East Wing. No dead. The Korath fleet is adjusting range. They'll find the center of the compound within the hour. Then we have an hour. Ithara studied the skyline through the shattered glass. Vaynara had been beautiful once, tiered market terraces carved from pale sandstone, copper-roofed temples that caught the morning light and turned the whole district amber, the great river Sheserin cutting south through lavender groves whose pollen used to drift across the city like purple snow. Now the terraces were rubble. The temples were field hospitals. The lavender groves had been stripped for firewood 3 days ago. The river was the only supply line the Korath blockade hadn't strangled, and even that was failing. The gorge approaches were mined, and the last supply barge had been turned back by warning fire 40 hours ago. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table, feeling the vibration of another impact somewhere to the north. 30,000 civilians sheltering in a city built for 12,000. 6 days of orbital bombardment. 2 attempted ground assaults repelled by sheer geography, the river gorge on 3 sides, the ridgeline on the 4th, and the remnants of the Velsundren Royal Guard. A 3rd assault would come when the bombardment had softened enough. And no relief fleet, no allies answering. The conquered assembly had declared Ithara's claim illegitimate 3 months ago, after the Korath-backed coup removed her from the capital at Velsundra. As far as the galactic diplomatic channels were concerned, Queen Ithara Velsundren was not a queen. She was an insurgent. Vaynara was not a besieged city. It was a pocket of resistance the new government had every right to reduce. The distinction was a death sentence dressed in parliamentary language. "Thesic," she said quietly, "the water filtration unit. Functional, but the filters are degrading. 48 hours, perhaps 60, before the output drops below safe levels for the children. The adults will start showing toxicity symptoms within 72. 60 hours, 72. She calculated it against the food stores, the medical supplies, the ammunition reserves. None of the numbers aligned. None of them said anything but surrender or die, and surrendering to the Korath meant a show trial in the capital, an execution broadcast across the sector, and 30,000 refugees reclassified as enemy combatants. Dying meant the same thing but without the trial. Have Dr. Shaline begin conserving surgical supplies for contamination cases, Ithara said, and cut the water ration to half portions for all adults, effective immediately. Children and medical patients exempted. Thesic noted it. He did not argue. He had stopped arguing 3 days ago when the mathematics had become incontrovertible. Now he simply executed her orders and kept his counsel, and she was grateful for it, because counsel required hope, and hope required resources she had already spent. The memory surged again, uninvited. Not the war, not the city, a different siege, a different lifetime. Verath Station 12 years ago. The joint humanitarian outpost on the border of the Korath disputed zone, where a young Velsundren princess had been sent by her mother, Queen Disara, to prove her diplomatic credentials. She had been 23, idealistic, certain that diplomacy could prevent the border conflict from escalating. The station had been a cramped, overheated facility housing 40 personnel from 6 species. and a human logistics contingent of 8 had been assigned to keep the infrastructure running. She had hated humans at first, not personally, categorically. They were loud. They made eye contact with an intensity that bordered on confrontation. They laughed too easily and treated hierarchy as a suggestion rather than a structure. The worst offender had been the logistics team leader, a broad-shouldered man of 30 named Cole Adler, who spoke standard galactic with a flat accent that placed every vowel wrong and who addressed everyone, regardless of rank or species, with the same measured calm. He'd fixed the station's failing water reclamation system in 9 hours. 3 Velsundran engineers had spent a week diagnosing it. Cole Adler had walked into the treatment bay, looked at the system, asked 2 questions, pulled 3 panels, and rebuilt the flow regulator from salvaged parts. He hadn't boasted about it. He hadn't filed a report or requested commendation. He'd simply appeared at her door that evening with a canteen of clean water and said, "You looked thirsty." And the informality of it, a logistics officer addressing a princess of the Velsundran dynasty without title, without honorific, without the deferential cant that every alien and every courtier had given her since birth, had been so shocking that she'd nearly had him removed from the station. She hadn't. She'd taken the canteen instead, and the water had tasted like nothing she'd ever had, because it was the first thing anyone had given her without calculating what they'd get in return. That had been the beginning. The middle had been 3 months of conversation, first professional, then personal, then something that existed in a register neither of them had vocabulary for. He taught her a card game from his homeworld. She taught him the formal structure of Velsundran court poetry. He'd listened with the same careful attention he gave to a failing pump system, and she'd realized, with a quiet shock, that he was the first person in her life who was interested in what she thought rather than what she represented. The end had come with the evacuation, and after that silence, and after the silence Sindoris Prime. But she would not think about Sindoris Prime. Not now. Another mortar cracked the morning air. Ithara blinked, pulled herself back to the present. The war, the city, the 30,000 souls depending on her refusal to yield. Your luminance. Thesic was watching her with that careful expression he wore when he thought she was drifting. He was one of 4 advisors who'd followed her into exile after the coup. The rest had scattered, some to neutral ports, some to the Korath-backed regime, one to a quiet retirement on a world that didn't have an extradition treaty. Loyalty, Ithara had learned, was a currency that inflated under pressure. The few who still spent it freely were the only wealth she had left. "I'm here," she said. "Show me the defensive positions." He unrolled the tactical overlay across the table. Blue markers for her positions, scattered thin across the ridgeline and the northern approaches. Red for the Korath ground forces massing on the far side of the ridge. An estimated 4,000 regulars with armored support and orbital fire coordination. Her 230 royal guards were experienced, well-trained, and absolutely inadequate. She studied the overlay the way she'd been taught, dispassionately, analytically, looking for the fulcrum point where a smaller force could hold against a larger one. There wasn't one. The geography favored defense. The gorge made flanking difficult. The ridgeline funneled attackers into killing corridors, but geography was a delaying mechanism, not a solution. Against 4,000 with unlimited orbital support, the mathematics converged on one outcome. It was just a question of how many days the subtraction took. "What about the Thessan envoy?" she asked. "Any word?" Thesic shook his head. "Their frequency went silent 6 hours ago. I suspect the Korath jammed it. The Thessan government has been sympathetic to our claim, but sympathy without communications is just sentiment." So the last diplomatic channel was gone. Ithara absorbed this the way she'd absorbed every loss over the past 3 months, with a stillness that had become her only armor. Rage was a luxury. Grief was a luxury. She could afford neither. She could afford to be stone, and so she was stone, and the stone held the city, and the city held the people, and that was all that mattered. The memory found her anyway. Not Varath Station this time, but the garden on Sindaris Prime. 2 years after the station. She'd been a senior diplomatic envoy by then, brokering the Cathari trade accords, and Cole had been reassigned to the same sector, something about human infrastructure support for the border colonies. They'd found each other at a diplomatic reception in the embassy gardens. He'd been standing at the edge of the terrace, alone, looking out at the twin moons of Sindaris hanging low and blue above the tree line, holding a glass of something he wasn't tasting. "You're not mingling," she'd said, stepping up beside him. He'd turned, the same steady eyes gray-green, the color of deep water in certain light, the jaw a little more weathered, a faint scar along the left side that hadn't been there before. He wore a civilian jacket over his utility clothes, his concession to the formal setting. "Neither are you." They talked for 3 hours. Not about politics, not about the accords, not about the Koreth border disputes that were already beginning to simmer toward violence. About music. A human composer named Sadie, whose pieces Cole said sounded like rain on still water, and a Velsundran chamber instrument called the Tessevra, whose harmonics could make the listener's skin flush violet. About the way light moved through atmosphere on different worlds, the particular amber of sunset through methane clouds, the crisp white of a binary star system at noon. About a children's song from his homeworld that his mother used to sing before he fell asleep, and a lullaby from hers that she hummed 2 bars of before she caught herself and stopped. He'd noticed the catch. He'd noticed, and he'd said nothing, and the silence he'd given her in that moment was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. It had been the first time since her mother's death that she'd spoken to anyone who wasn't calculating her value. Not her rank, not her bloodline, not her usefulness to a faction or a cause. Her. The woman behind the title, who liked Tessevra music and had a terrible singing voice, and had once burned a formal dinner trying to cook a traditional dish from memory, because the palace chefs had never let her near a stove. Near the end of the evening, standing at the edge of the terrace while the other diplomats mingled inside, she told him, "I have to go back to Velsundra next month. My mother's health is failing. The succession line needs to be formalized." "I know," he'd said, 2 words. No protest, no plea, no dramatic farewell, no attempt to reshape the world into one where duty didn't win. Just those 2 words, and the way he'd looked at her, not with hunger or desire, but with the quiet, absolute recognition of someone who understood that what she carried was heavier than anything she could set down, and that loving her meant letting her carry it. She'd left for Velsundra. Her mother had died 4 months later. Ithara had become queen. Cole had been reassigned to the outer colonies. They hadn't spoken again. Not once. Not a letter, not a transmission, not a message passed through intermediaries. 12 years of silence so complete it had its own gravity. And now she was a deposed queen in a collapsing city, and wherever Cole Adler was, he was living another life in another part of the galaxy, and the memory of his face was just another thing she couldn't afford to hold. "Your Luminance." Lieutenant Ravon, her communications officer, stood in the doorway with dust on her uniform and urgency in her dark, reflective eyes. Ravon was young, 26, barely older than Ithara had been on Varath Station, and she had the sharp, nervous competence of someone who had been trained for peacetime and was discovering what she was made of in war. "We're receiving a transmission on an unregistered frequency. It's not Korath. It's not Thesson. The encryption signature is," she hesitated, checking the data pad in her hand, "it's human." Ithara's hands went still on the edge of the table. "Source. Unknown origin, but the signal strength indicates the transmitter is inside the bombardment perimeter. Someone is already in the city." Ithara looked at Thesic. He shook his head slowly, his gray-blue features tightening. "We've had no human presence in Velsundran territory for 8 years. Not since the conquered pulled all human advisory staff after the border disputes were formalized. "Play the transmission," Ithara said. Rivan set a portable comm unit on the table. Static hissed, crackled, then resolved into a voice, low, calm, unhurried, speaking standard galactic with an accent that placed the vowels slightly flatter and the consonants slightly harder than any alien species would. "This is Adler, requesting contact with whoever is running the defense of Vaynara. I have cargo, medical supplies, water filtration cores, and comm relay components. I need a safe corridor to the staging area and someone who can tell me where to put them." Adler out. The room went silent. Thesic stared at the comm unit. Rivan looked at Ithara. One of the guards by the door shifted his weight, uncertain. Ithara didn't move. She was aware of her heartbeat in a way she hadn't been in years, not racing, not stuttering, but heavy, deliberate. A deep, slow percussion, as though something inside her chest was recalibrating to a frequency it had forgotten it could receive. Cole Adler in her city, during her war, 12 years of silence, and he'd broken it with a logistics report. She breathed once slowly and said, "Open a channel." The static crackled, cleared. She leaned toward the comm unit and spoke in the voice she'd constructed for courts and councils, and the men who wanted to destroy her, steady, measured, utterly controlled, every syllable a wall. "This is Ithara Velsundren. Identify your vessel and your authorization." A pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3, but she felt every one of them. Then, "No vessel, groundside. I came in through the river gorge on a cargo skiff. Authorization is 6 crates of medical supplies and 12 Mark 7 filtration cores that your people need before tomorrow. That's my authorization." Thesic's eyes widened. Coming through the river gorge meant running the Korath blockade at water level, below the sensor floor, through mined approaches and past patrol boats. It was theoretically possible. It was also the act of either a madman or a man who had decided that theoretical possibility was sufficient. "How did you know we needed filtration cores?" Ithara asked. Another pause. "I've been monitoring your situation for 3 weeks. Your water output signatures dropped below sustainable levels 9 days ago. The degradation curve was obvious if you knew what to look for." 3 weeks. He'd been watching for 3 weeks, tracking her situation from outside the blockade, reading environmental data, calculating her water system's failure rate, planning the run through the gorge, sourcing the exact filtration cores her systems required. And he hadn't announced himself until he was already inside the perimeter with the supplies in hand. That was Cole. That had always been Cole. Not the declaration, not the grand gesture. The solved problem presented without fanfare, as though crossing a blockade in a cargo skiff were merely the next item on a maintenance checklist. "Rivan, send a security detail to the river staging docks. Escort our guests to the eastern staging area." She paused, keeping her voice level. "And have Dr. Shalling's medical team ready to receive cargo." Rivan moved quickly. Thesic remained, watching Ithara with the expression of a man who had served her for 19 years, who had followed her through a coup and an exile and a siege, and who could read the geography of her composure better than anyone alive. "You know this human," he said, "not a question." "I knew him. A long time ago. Your luminance." "It doesn't matter who he is, Thesic. It matters what he brought." She straightened, squaring her shoulders the way her mother had taught her, spine like a blade, chin level, every line of the body saying, "I am still here." "We needed those filtration cores. He has them. Everything else is irrelevant." She said it firmly enough that she almost believed it. The memory of Verath Station came again as she walked the corridors toward the staging area, and this time she let it run. The 3rd month on the station, when the border skirmishes had ignited and the evacuation order had come through on a priority channel, everyone scrambling to pack essential equipment while the perimeter alarms screamed. She'd been in the water treatment bay alone, trying to salvage environmental data that the diplomatic corps needed for their border dispute filing, when the explosion had ripped through the south wall. She'd been thrown sideways. Her left arm had been pinned under a collapsed ceiling beam, and the weight of it had been enormous, not just the physical mass but the disbelief, the understanding that she was trapped in a burning room and that her rank, her bloodline, her title, all of it was meaningless against the weight of steel. Dust and heat and the sound of structural failure, and her voice calling for help into a corridor that no one was in. And then Cole, appearing through the smoke as though the universe had manufactured him specifically for that moment. No words, no wasted motion. He'd assessed the beam, braced his feet, gripped the steel and lifted. It had taken everything he had. She'd seen the cords in his neck stand out, his shoulders shaking with the strain, and later she'd learned he'd torn the rotator cuff in his right shoulder doing it, an injury he'd carried for 6 months afterward. But he'd lifted the beam, pulled her free, gathered her against his chest, and carried her through 2 collapsing corridors to the evacuation shuttle, and his hands had been steady the entire time. In the shuttle, bleeding from a cut above her eye while the medic applied a sealant patch, she'd looked at him sitting across the aisle, sweating, his right arm hanging at a strange angle, his face gray with pain he wasn't acknowledging, and she'd said, "Thank you," and it had been the most inadequate word in any language she knew. He'd said, "Don't thank me, just drink some water," and handed her a canteen with his left hand, because his right couldn't lift that high. She'd laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in front of anyone outside her family in years. The sound had startled them both, and something had passed between them in the aftershock of that laughter. A recognition that neither of them had the words for yet, that wouldn't have words until Sindaris Prime, and that by Sindaris Prime would be too late to act on. She killed the memory at the door to the staging area. This was now. This was the war. Cole Adler was a former logistics officer who'd arrived on a cargo skiff with no authorization, and she was a queen holding a city with her fingernails. Whatever they had been to each other was a language neither of them spoke anymore. The staging area was a converted market hall, its copper roof panels dented from shrapnel but structurally intact. The security detail had escorted him in. He was standing near the loading dock, directing 2 of her guards in the unloading of gray cargo crates marked with human standard logistics codes, the kind of precise labeling that military supply officers used. He was older, 41, 42, she'd lost count. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, threaded with gray at the temples. The scar along his jaw had deepened into a permanent line, white against his weathered skin. He wore civilian clothes, a cargo jacket the color of sand, heavy boots, no armor, no insignia, no rank markings. His hands were the same, square, capable, moving with the unconscious efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life making things work. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes found hers across the width of the market hall, and the 12 years contracted to nothing. He didn't bow, he didn't salute. He'd never done either. He said, "Your water's running out." "I'm aware," she said. "Of Mark 7 filtration cores. Compatible with Vel Sundren environmental specs, I cross-referenced your system schematics from the Verath Station engineering files." He tapped the nearest crate. "Medical supplies in the 4 on the left. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, surgical sealant, trauma kits, electrolyte concentrates. Not enough for 30,000 people long-term, but enough to keep your field hospitals functional for another week. Maybe 8 days if Dr. Shaleen rations carefully." A week, 8 days. In the mathematics of siege warfare, that was either nothing or everything, depending on what happened inside those days. Ithara felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but the shadow of it, the ghost of a breath she hadn't been able to take. "How did you get through the gorge?" she asked. "Low and slow. The Koreth sensor arrays are calibrated for military threat profiles, fast-moving, high-metallic thermal hot. A cargo skiff with a cold-running drive at river speed reads like debris. I kept the hull against the north wall of the gorge where the mineral deposits scatter the sensor returns. He paused. It took 11 hours. It wasn't comfortable. Thesic arrived behind her, flanked by 2 additional guards. He studied Cole with the careful suspicion of a military officer who had spent 6 days waiting for the next assault, and had just watched an unannounced human walk through his perimeter, carrying exactly what they needed. "Commander Thesic," Ithara said, "this is Cole Adler, former human logistics officer, Verath Station humanitarian mission 12 years ago." "Former," Cole confirmed. "Private sector now, infrastructure consulting." "Infrastructure consulting," Thesic repeated flatly. "Water systems, primarily. I design and install filtration networks for frontier colonies." He gestured at the crates. These were inventory from a contract on Essara Drift that fell through when the client's government collapsed. "When I picked up the Vaynara situation on the border monitors, I redirected." "You redirected military-grade filtration equipment into an active combat zone, through a blockade, on a cargo skiff, without authorization from any government or military body." Cole looked at him steadily. "Yes." Thesic glanced at Ithara. She met his gaze and held it, the silent conversation of 2 people who had been through enough together that words were redundant. After a moment, the commander exhaled through his nostrils, a Vel-Sundran gesture of reluctant acceptance, and turned to supervise the unloading. Ithara and Cole stood 4 meters apart in a converted market hall while her city shook around them, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was the densest substance in the room. 12 years of letters never written, calls never placed, words never spoken, a border that had become a wall and then a war, and then a distance so vast that crossing it required either impossibility or cargo skiff. "You should have contacted me before running the gorge," she said finally. "You would have told me not to come." "Yes. That's why I didn't contact you." She felt the corner of her mouth move, not quite a smile, but the muscle memory of one. She suppressed it. Queens in wartime did not smile at human logistics officers who appeared out of the smoke with precisely the supplies they needed, no matter how many years of silence they'd broken to do it. "You can't stay," she said. "The Korath will tighten the blockade. The gorge route won't work twice." "I know. Then why are you here?" He looked at her, the same steady gaze she remembered from a terrace on Sindaris Prime, looking at twin moons, holding a drink he wasn't tasting. "Because your water was running out." She absorbed this. She knew what he meant, and she knew what he wasn't saying, and the distance between those 2 things was the exact shape of everything they'd never allowed themselves to name. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just drink some water." And despite everything, the war, the siege, the 30,000 lives balanced on her composure, something cracked open in her chest. And for one breath she was standing in an evacuation shuttle with a cut above her eye, laughing for the first time in years. She turned away before it showed on her face. The next 36 hours were the most critical of the siege. The Korath bombardment shifted pattern, tighter concentrations, closer intervals, walking the impacts methodically across the northern defensive positions. Thesic read it as preparation for the 3rd ground assault. Ithara concurred. She spent the night in the command center, reviewing defensive options, repositioning her thin line of royal guards along the ridgeline, calculating angles of fire and retreat corridors, and the rate at which she was spending lives she couldn't replace. Cole worked without being asked and without stopping. He installed the 12 filtration cores in the underground water system, replacing the degraded filters one by one, recalibrating the flow rates to account for the increased sediment load from the bombardment. Shattered stone and mortar dust were contaminating the groundwater intake. By morning, the water output had tripled. Refugees in the shelter vaults who had been rationing mouthfuls were drinking full cups. The field hospitals had clean water for surgeries. Children were being bathed for the first time in 6 days. It was not a victory. It was the removal of one way to die. He also found the backup communications array, knocked out on the 3rd day of bombardment, written off by Rivan as irreparable, and rebuilt it. Ithara hadn't asked him to. He'd noticed the dead equipment on his way through the compound, assessed the damage, stripped compatible components from his own cargo skiff's navigation and communication systems, and assembled a working array from the wreckage. The cargo skiff was now inert. He'd cannibalized its comm system, its nav relays, and its backup power cells. He had no way to leave. When the array came online, they picked up signals they'd been missing for 3 days, including a fragmentary, repeating transmission from a Thessan diplomatic convoy that was still operational, still moving through the sector, still trying to reach the conquered assembly with documented evidence of Korath violations of the Vaynara Accords. Bombardment of civilian infrastructure, use of prohibited ordnance in a populated area, blockade of humanitarian supplies. If that convoy reaches the assembly, Rivan said, studying the signal data with widening eyes, the conquered may reverse its position. Declare your claim legitimate. Order the Korath to stand down. May, Thessic said. May is more than we had yesterday, Ithara replied. She looked at Rivan. Can we boost the signal? Help the convoy cut through the Korath jamming. With the array Mr. Adler rebuilt, possibly. If I can lock a relay chain using the Thessan carrier frequency and the human nav system components, I might be able to punch a clear signal corridor through the jamming field. But I'll need time, and the array has to stay intact. How much time? 45 minutes to lock the relay, maybe an hour. Ithara nodded. Do it. She found Cole on the roof of the staging area at dusk, sitting against a ventilation housing, drinking water from one of his own canteens. He'd been working for 14 hours straight. His cargo jacket was off, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his forearms streaked with grease and dust. The sky was bruised purple and orange, the kind of sunset that made Vaynara's destruction look almost beautiful, which was obscene. She sat down beside him, not close, not far, the distance of people who had once been closer than this and were trying to remember where the boundaries were. The convoy, she said. If they reach the assembly, there's a chance. I heard. He took another drink. Your comm officer is sharp. She'll find a way to boost the Thessan signal using the array and the relay frequencies from my skiff's nav system. I left notes for her, frequency tables, signal attenuation curves, the modulation patterns that work best against Korath jamming profiles. You left notes. I'm a logistics officer. Leaving notes is what I do. She looked at the horizon. The Korath fleet was visible as faint lights in the upper atmosphere, a constellation of threat, patient and methodical, waiting for the bombardment to finish its work so the infantry could finish theirs. Below, the city was dark except for the glow of field hospital windows and the occasional spark of a cook fire in the refugee shelters where families were huddled together, eating half rations, drinking clean water for the first time in days because a human had crossed a blockade in a cargo skiff. You cannibalized your skiff, she said. I did. You have no way to leave. I know. That was deliberate. He didn't answer immediately. He set the canteen on the rooftop beside him and looked at his hands, scraped knuckles, engine grease under the nails, blisters forming where he'd gripped tools for 14 hours. The skiff's nav system had the components Rivan needed for the relay chain. The skiff's power cells could keep the array running through the bombardment. The skiff's comm system had the frequency tables for punching through Korath jamming. All of that was more useful installed in your infrastructure than sitting in a dead cargo bay. He paused. It was a logistics decision. It was a decision to stay. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She felt the silence settle around them again, not the heavy silence of the market hall, but something quieter, more fragile. The silence of two people sitting on a rooftop in a city under siege, watching the same sunset they might have watched together on Sindaris Prime 12 years ago if either of them had been brave enough to ask. "Why did you really come?" she asked. Not the question she'd asked in the staging area, a different question with a different weight behind it. He was quiet for a long time. Then, 12 years ago on Sindaris Prime, you told me you had to go home, succession, duty. I said, I know. And I let you go because that was the correct thing to do. I've spent 12 years knowing it was correct. I've never been sure it was right. Ithara's hands tightened in her lap. She said nothing. I've been fixing water systems on frontier colonies for a decade. Good work. Important work. I built filtration networks on 9 worlds. I kept people alive who would have died of contamination. And every time I finished a job and packed up and moved to the next colony, there was this. He searched for the word. Space. Not loneliness exactly. More like a room I'd furnished with everything I needed except the one piece that made it make sense. Coal. 3 weeks ago I intercepted a signal fragment from the Korath border. Bombardment of Vaynara. Queen Ithara Velsundren holding the city with 200 guards and 30,000 refugees. Water systems failing. He picked up the canteen. I didn't deliberate. I didn't weigh options. I started loading the skiff. You could have been killed in the gorge. Yes. You could be killed here. You will be killed here if the third assault breaks through. Also yes. And you came anyway. He looked at her. The sunset caught the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the scar along his jaw. He was not handsome. He was never going to be handsome. He was weathered and scarred and 40-something and held together by competence and quiet resolve, and he was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 12 years. I've spent 12 years being correct, Ithara. I came here to be right. She felt the words settle into her like stones dropped into still water, each one finding its exact depth, disturbing the surface, sinking to a place she hadn't let anyone reach since Sindaris Prime. I mourned you, she said softly, not because you died, because you didn't. Because you were alive somewhere, building water systems, and I was alive somewhere else, being a queen, and the distance between those two lives was a void I couldn't cross without abandoning everything I owed my people. I know. And now you're here and my people are dying and I still can't. She stopped, breathed. The queen's composure held barely. The cracks were internal, structural, the kind that don't show on the surface until the building falls. I can't choose. Do you understand? I'm the last thing standing between 30,000 people and the Korath. If I fracture, if I let anything in that isn't the war, I lose them. I'm not asking you to fracture, he said quietly. I came to fix your water, that's what I do, I fix things. He offered the canteen. When the water's fixed, I fix the next thing, and the thing after that. And if the convoy reaches the assembly and the conquered intervenes and the Korath stand down and you're still standing and your people are still alive, then maybe, if there's time, I'll ask you to have a cup of water with me. Not as a queen, just as the woman who laughed on an evacuation shuttle 12 years ago. She turned her face away so he wouldn't see her eyes. Morning brought the third assault. The Korath came from the north in armored columns at first light, infantry, mechanized armor, close air support from atmospheric fighters that screamed low over the rooftops and strafed the defensive positions along the ridge. Ithara was in the command center, directing the defense, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had been trained from birth to lead, and had never needed that training more than in this hour. Pull the outer pickets back to the secondary line. Let them into the market district. The rubble channels their armor into single-file corridors. Concentrate fire on the infantry escorts once the vehicles are separated. Your luminance, if we concede the market district. We're trading space for attrition. The armor can't maneuver in the narrow streets. Their infantry will be cut off from vehicle support. That's where we hit them." Thesic relayed the orders. The guards fell back in disciplined steps, giving ground meter by meter, drawing the Koreth advance into the rubble maze of the destroyed market terraces. It worked. The armored vehicles jammed at intersections. Infantry squads lost coordination. The royal guards, fighting from prepared positions in collapsed buildings, made them pay for every block. Cole was in the underground water facility when the first shells hit the northern compound wall. He felt the impact through the stone floor, checked the filtration systems for damage. The underground vaults were solid, built centuries ago for exactly this kind of siege, and made his way to the surface. He found Rivan in the communications bay, hands shaking, working frantically on the signal relay he'd outlined in his notes. "The Thessan convoy?" he asked. "Broadcasting. I need 45 minutes to lock the relay chain and punch through the Koreth jamming." Her voice was strained. "If the bombardment hits the array." "I'll keep the array running," he said, and went to the roof. The comm array was a jury-rigged assembly of salvaged components, Velsundren's signal hardware, human nav systems stripped from his cargo skiff, and a Thessan relay amplifier that Rivan had fabricated from spare parts and determination. It was ugly and brilliant, and it was the only thing that could punch a clear signal through the Koreth jamming field. The atmospheric fighters made another strafing pass. Shells hit a building 2 blocks east. Debris showered the rooftop. A piece of copper roofing whipped past his head close enough to feel the wind of it. Cole checked the array connections, replaced a coupling that had shaken loose from its mount, braced the main antenna with his shoulder, and held it steady with both hands while the world shook. Below in the command center, Ithara tracked the ground assault on the tactical overlay. The Koreth armor had entered the market district as she'd predicted. The narrow streets slowed them. Her royal guards hit the exposed infantry from elevated positions, controlled, precise, conserving ammunition they couldn't replace. The Koreth advance stalled against the rubble. But it wouldn't stall forever. 4,000 against 230. The equation was remorseless, and every minute subtracted from her side faster than from theirs. "Rivan, status on the relay," Ithara said into her comm. 30 minutes. The signal is building. The human is holding the array together manually on the roof. Of course he was. Ithara closed her eyes for 1 second, 1 breath. Then she opened them and went back to the war. 20 minutes later, the Koreth committed their reserve, fresh troops, mechanized infantry, coming from the eastern approach. A flanking move she'd anticipated but couldn't fully counter with her depleted forces. She pulled 20 guards from the southern perimeter to reinforce the east, leaving the south held by a skeleton force and nothing else. "Your luminance," Thesic's voice was strained, controlled, the voice of a man holding professional calm against the weight of arithmetic. "The eastern flank will hold for 1 hour, perhaps 90 minutes. After that, they reach the palace compound. After that, we fall back to the compound. Final perimeter." She said it the way she said everything now, calmly, clearly, as though describing a schedule rather than a last stand. 30,000 refugees in the basement vaults, the remnants of her guard on the walls, and a queen who had already decided quietly in a part of her mind that she didn't let anyone see, that she would not leave. "Rivan," she said into the comm, "how long?" 15 minutes. The signal is almost locked if the array holds." "It will hold," Ithara said. Not because she was certain, because she knew who was on the roof, and she knew what he was made of, and that was the closest thing to certainty she had left. 14 minutes stretched to the length of hours. The eastern flank buckled. Guards fell back through rubble-choked streets, fighting for every meter, buying time with courage and the geometry of collapsed buildings. The Koreth pressed forward with methodical, grinding patience. Ithara directed the retreat with cold precision, moving units on the overlay like pieces on a board, knowing that every piece she moved was a person, and that some of them would not survive the next move. Then Rivan's voice, sharp and bright and breaking. Signal locked. The Thessan convoy has our transmission. They're relaying to the conquered assembly full data package, bombardment records, civilian casualty numbers, evidence of Korath violations of the Vaynara Accords. Confirmed receipt. Confirmed. The assembly emergency session convenes in. Rivan's voice cracked with something that might have been disbelief or relief or both. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which the Korath ground assault would reach the palace compound. 40 minutes during which everything depended on a roomful of diplomats in a chamber light years away, deciding that Ithara Vel Sundren was a queen and not an insurgent. Thessic, she said, hold the eastern line for 40 minutes. Your luminance, the mathematics are. Hold it. He held it. For 37 minutes, 200 Vel Sundren royal guards held a line that 4,000 Korath regulars threw themselves against, and it cost them 11 dead, 31 wounded, ammunition reserves dropping to nearly nothing. But they held. And then the transmission came, not from the Thessan convoy, not from the conquered assembly, from the Korath fleet itself, broadcast on an open frequency, audible to every receiver in the combat zone. All Korath forces stand down. Repeat, all forces stand down immediately. The conquered assembly has issued emergency binding resolution 714. Ceasefire effective immediately. All ground forces withdraw to pre-assault staging positions. Fleet elements disengage from bombardment posture. Compliance is mandatory. Stand down. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Ithara had ever heard. She stood at the war table, her hands flat on the surface, and listened to the absence of shellfire. The building stopped vibrating for the first time in 6 days. The tactical overlay showed red markers pulling back, retreating, disengaging. Blue markers, her people, her guards, her thin, brave, battered line, held their positions and watched the enemy withdraw. Thessic was the first to speak. Your luminance. The Assembly's resolution recognizes your sovereignty. The coup is declared illegitimate. Korath withdrawal from all Vel Sundren territory is mandated within 72 hours. Violation triggers conquered military enforcement. Ithara nodded. She did not celebrate, she did not weep. She stood very still and let the information settle into her bones, vertebra by vertebra, and then she said, Rivan, broadcast to all shelters. The bombardment has ended. Ceasefire is in effect. The conquered has recognized our sovereignty. The cheering started faintly, rising from the basement vaults beneath the palace. 30,000 voices, ragged and disbelieving and alive. She walked to the roof. She needed air. She needed sky. She needed to see the world without a tactical overlay between her and it. Cole was still there, sitting against the ventilation housing, his hands raw from holding antenna couplings during the bombardment. Blistered palms, scraped knuckles, a shallow cut across the back of his right hand where a piece of debris had caught him. He looked up when she appeared, and his expression was not triumphant. It was tired and steady and waiting. She sat down beside him, closer this time, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The sunset was burning across the western sky, painting the ruined city in copper and gold. Somewhere below, medics were treating the wounded. Somewhere else, children were climbing out of the basement shelters, blinking in the fading light, touching the open air as though it were something fragile. The war was over. The city had held. The queen had held. Your hands, she said. He looked at them. The main antenna coupling kept slipping under the concussion. I held it manually. For how long? 53 minutes, but who's counting? She reached out and took his right hand. Not impulsively, deliberately, with the precise intentionality of a woman who had spent 12 years measuring every gesture, every word, every allowance of vulnerability, and had decided that some debts were worth more than the composure they cost. His hand was warm, rougher than she remembered. The calluses were different, not the station maintenance calluses of Verath, but the deep, worn-in texture of a man who had spent a decade building water systems on frontier worlds with his own hands. "I owe you a cup of water," she said. He looked at their hands, then at her. "Technically, you owe me 12 years of cups of water." "Then we'd better start now." His fingers closed around hers, not tightly, gently. The grip of someone who understood that what he was holding was not just a hand, but a decision, hers, freely made, for the first time since she'd left Sindaris Prime 12 years ago. The last light of the sunset caught the ruined copper rooftops and turned them molten. Below, Vaynara was stirring back to life, cautious, damaged but breathing. The Queen sat on the roof of a converted market hall with a human who had crossed a blockade in a cargo skiff because her water was running out, and for the first time in 12 years, the room inside her had every piece it needed. He reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand and produced a canteen, battered, scratched, dented on one side. The same model he'd carried on Verath Station. She didn't know if it was the same one. It didn't matter. "You look thirsty," he said. She took the canteen. She drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal and dust and 12 years of silence, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She gave it back. He drank. The canteen passed between them like a treaty neither of them needed to sign. Below in the shelters, a child had started singing, an old Velsundran lullaby, the same one Ithara had almost hummed on a terrace on Sindaris Prime 12 years ago, before she'd caught herself and stopped. She didn't stop now. She hummed along, quietly, and the sound rose into the evening air above a city that had held, a queen who had held, and a man who had crossed a war to fix the water because that was the only language he had ever known for love. Thesic found them there an hour later, when the first stars were emerging and the Korath fleet's lights were pulling away from their bombardment orbits. He stood in the rooftop doorway, taking in the sight of his queen sitting shoulder to shoulder with a human, their hands linked, looking at the sky as though they had never seen it before. He cleared his throat. "Your Luminance, the Assembly's resolution includes provisions for humanitarian aid convoys. The first is expected within 18 hours. We'll need to coordinate landing zones, supply distribution, and medical triage staging." "Cole will handle the logistics," Ithara said, without looking away from the sky. Thesic glanced at the human. Cole met his gaze. Something passed between them, not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of recognition. The commander nodded once slowly. "I'll send the landing coordinates to Mr. Adler's comm unit." He paused. "Your Luminance, there's also the matter of formal communications with the Assembly. They'll expect an official response to the sovereignty resolution." "Draft it, I'll review it in the morning." She paused. "And Thesic include a provision for permanent human infrastructure advisory staff at Vaynara, water systems, filtration networks, long-term reconstruction." Thesic's mouth twitched, the first expression other than worry she'd seen on him in 6 days. "As your Luminance commands." He withdrew into the stairwell. The rooftop was quiet. "Permanent infrastructure advisory staff," Cole said. "Permanent," she said. "That's a long contract." "It is." He lifted their joined hands, studying them, her slender gray-blue fingers, his square, scarred ones, intertwined. "I should tell you that I'm not particularly good at permanent. I've spent 12 years moving from colony to colony. I don't own anything that doesn't fit in a cargo skiff." "You don't have a cargo skiff anymore. You cannibalized it." "Fair point." "Then you'll have to stay and maintain the systems you installed." The stars were coming out above Vaynara, one by one, filling the sky the way voices were filling the shelters below, cautiously, then all at once. The lullaby had spread from the first child to others, and the sound drifted up through the broken city like something growing from the rubble. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I crossed a blockade for you." You crossed a blockade for my water systems. Same thing. And there it was, not a declaration, not a vow, not any of the grand dramatic gestures that the courts and the councils and the histories would have demanded. Just a quiet statement of equivalence from a man who had always spoken in the language of solved problems, and a queen who had finally learned to hear it. She leaned her shoulder against his. He leaned back. They sat together on the roof while the city came back to life beneath them, and the silence between them was no longer a void. It was a room, fully furnished at last. Down in the command center, Thesic, standing at the window, listening to the lullaby rising from the vaults, made a final entry in the duty log. His hand was steady. His script was precise. Status Vaynara operational, water systems restored, communications array functional, sovereignty recognized by Concord Assembly Resolution 714, ceasefire in effect, humanitarian aid convoy inbound, 18 hours. And then, because he was a careful man who believed in accurate records, he added one line that was not, strictly speaking, operational. The Queen is no longer alone.